The grand ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel sparkled with elegance on that sunny Saturday afternoon. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm glow over the white and gold decorations that filled the space. In the bridal suite upstairs, Victoria Chen stood in front of a full-length mirror, admiring her reflection with a satisfied smile. "This dress is absolutely perfect," she whispered to herself, running her manicured fingers over the expensive silk fabric. The wedding dress had cost more than what most people earned in a year, but Victoria didn't care. This was her special day, and everything had to be perfect. At 28 years old, Victoria had already made a name for herself as one of the youngest successful investment bankers in the city. She came from a wealthy family, and her life had always been filled with luxury. Today, she was about to marry James Harrison, a handsome and talented surgeon who seemed to match her in every way. Sarah, her maid of honor and best friend since college, walked into the room carrying a glass of champagne. "Here's your drink, Queen Victoria," she said with a laugh. "The guests are starting to arrive, and everything looks amazing downstairs." Victoria took a sip of the champagne and checked her makeup one last time. Her dark hair was styled in elegant waves, and her makeup artists had spent hours creating the perfect look. "Have you seen James?" she asked Sarah. "He's greeting some guests with his father," Sarah replied. "By the way, did his mother finally arrive? I haven't seen her at any of the wedding events this week." A small frown appeared on Victoria's face. In the 2 years she had been dating James, she had never met his mother. He always said she worked abroad, helping communities in different countries. Victoria had found it strange but didn't push the topic since James seemed uncomfortable talking about it. "I guess she's still traveling," Victoria said, shrugging her shoulders. "James said she might not make it." The wedding planner, Mrs. Thompson, knocked on the door and entered with a clipboard in hand. "Miss Chen, it's time. Are you ready?" Victoria took a deep breath and nodded. This was the moment she had been dreaming of since she was a little girl. As she walked down the hallway toward the hotel's grand staircase, her father waited for her with proud tears in his eyes. "My beautiful daughter," he said, taking her arm. "You look like a princess." The wedding ceremony was everything Victoria had hoped for. 250 guests watched as she walked down the aisle to the sound of a live string quartet. James stood at the altar, looking handsome in his designer tuxedo, his eyes filled with love as he watched her approach. Their vows were traditional but meaningful, and when they kissed as husband and wife, the ballroom erupted in applause. Victoria couldn't stop smiling as they walked back down the aisle together, now as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. The reception began immediately after the ceremony. Waiters in black and white uniforms moved smoothly through the crowd, serving expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. Victoria and James sat at their sweetheart table, accepting congratulations from their guests. "This is the most beautiful wedding I've ever been to," said one of Victoria's colleagues from the bank. "Everything is absolutely perfect." Victoria beamed with pride. She had spent months planning every detail, making sure nothing was out of place. The flowers were imported from Holland, the cake was made by a famous French pastry chef, and the band was flown in from New York. Money was no object when it came to creating her perfect day. As she looked around the room at all her wealthy friends and family members enjoying themselves, Victoria felt completely satisfied. She had the perfect dress, the perfect venue, the perfect husband, and now she would have the perfect life. Little did she know that in just a few hours, her perfect world would be turned upside down by a chance encounter with someone she least expected to meet on her wedding day. But for now, Victoria Chen Harrison sat in her bubble of happiness, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. As the wedding reception continued into the evening, Victoria felt more and more relaxed. She had already finished 3 glasses of expensive champagne, and a pleasant warmth spread through her body. The dance floor was full of happy guests, and the band played all her favorite songs. "Let's take some photos," called out Lisa, one of Victoria's bridesmaids. A group of Victoria's friends from the bank gathered around her, all of them dressed in designer outfits and dripping with expensive jewelry. Just as they were posing for pictures, there was a small commotion near one of the guest tables. Someone had accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine, creating a dark puddle on the cream-colored carpet. Victoria frowned as she watched the scene unfold. An elderly black woman in a gray janitor's uniform quietly appeared with cleaning supplies. She moved carefully between the tables, trying not to draw attention to herself as she began to clean up the spill. The woman worked efficiently, her experienced hands knowing exactly how to treat the stain. Victoria's pleasant mood suddenly changed. She turned to her friends with a look of disgust on her face. "Look at that," she said loudly, the champagne making her voice carry further than she realized. "Why would they send in cleaning staff during my reception? This is supposed to be a five-star hotel." Her friends shifted uncomfortably, but Victoria didn't notice their unease. The alcohol had loosened her tongue, and her privileged upbringing began to show its ugly side. "They could at least wait until the party is over," she continued, her voice getting even louder. "That uniform doesn't match my wedding aesthetic at all. This is completely ruining the atmosphere." A few nearby guests turned to look at Victoria, their expressions showing disappointment and shock. The janitor kept her head down, continuing her work without responding to the cruel comments. "I paid a fortune for this venue," Victoria went on, encouraged by the attention she was getting. "The least they could do is keep the help out of sight during my special day. This isn't some cheap restaurant." Sarah, her maid of honor, tried to intervene. "Victoria, maybe we should go check on the cake cutting schedule," she said softly, trying to distract her friend. But Victoria wasn't finished. Walking closer to where the janitor was working, Victoria stood with her hands on her hips. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "could you please do this later? I don't want my wedding photos ruined by someone cleaning in the background." The elderly woman slowly stood up, holding her cleaning supplies. For a brief moment, she lifted her eyes to meet Victoria's, and there was something in that look, a mixture of dignity and sadness, that should have made Victoria ashamed. But in her intoxicated state, Victoria missed it completely. The woman quietly nodded and began to walk away. As she did, Victoria turned back to her friends with a triumphant smile. "That's better. Now, where were we with those photos?" But her friends weren't smiling anymore. Some of them had already walked away, while others were looking past Victoria with concerned expressions. Victoria followed their gaze and saw James standing near the dance floor, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. She had never seen her new husband look so upset. James was always calm and collected, but now he looked like he might be sick. He caught Victoria's eye for a moment, then quickly turned away and hurried out of the ballroom. "What's wrong with him?" Victoria asked, genuinely confused. The champagne was making her head spin a little, and she couldn't understand why everyone was acting so strangely. The janitor had disappeared through a service door, and the wine stain was only half cleaned. Victoria's perfect wedding reception continued around her, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The laughter seemed more forced, the music a little too loud, and the smiles a little less genuine. Little did Victoria know that her cruel words had just set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. The woman she had just humiliated was far more important than she could have imagined, and her perfect wedding day was about to turn into a nightmare. James Harrison rushed through the hotel's elegant hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The woman he had married only hours ago had shown a side of herself that made him feel sick to his stomach. He loosened his bow tie, feeling like he couldn't breathe. Finding an empty conference room, James went inside and closed the door behind him. He leaned against the wall, trying to collect his thoughts. The image of his mother's face as Victoria mocked her kept playing in his mind. His wonderful, hard-working mother, who had sacrificed everything for him, had just been humiliated at what was supposed to be a joyous celebration. "Mom," he whispered to himself, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. He had to find her, had to make sure she was okay. This wasn't how the day was supposed to go. His mother had been so excited about finally meeting Victoria, about surprising her with the truth at the right moment during the reception. As James dialed his mother's number, there was a knock at the door. It was Robert, his best man and childhood friend who knew the truth about his family. "Hey," Robert said softly, stepping into the room. "I saw what happened out there. Are you okay?" James shook his head, his phone still ringing without an answer. "I can't reach her, Rob. I can't believe Victoria would act like that. I knew she could be a bit shallow sometimes, but this..." His voice trailed off as he thought about all the red flags he had ignored during their relationship. Robert put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Your mom is one of the strongest people I know. She's probably just taking some time to herself right now." "I should have told Victoria the truth from the beginning," James said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. But Mom insisted on keeping it quiet. She said she wanted to make sure Victoria loved me for who I am, not for what we have now. Through the walls, they could hear the muffled sound of music from the reception. The party was still going on as if nothing had happened, while James's world was falling apart. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. "I'm okay, son. I'm in the staff room. Don't worry about me." James immediately headed for the door, but Robert stopped him. "What are you going to tell Victoria?" Pausing with his hand on the doorknob, James took a deep breath. "The truth. All of it. She needs to know exactly who she just humiliated." As James walked through the hotel's back corridors toward the staff area, memories flooded his mind. He remembered watching his mother leave for work every morning when he was a child, wearing that same gray uniform. He remembered how she would come home tired, but would still help him with his homework. How she had worked extra shifts to pay for his medical school applications. How she had refused to quit her job even after he became a successful surgeon, saying that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of. When he reached the staff room door, he could hear quiet voices inside. He recognized the gentle tones of Mrs. Thompson, wedding planner, who apparently knew his mother from their years working at the hotel together. Before he could open the door, his phone buzzed again. It was Victoria. "Where are you?" "Everyone's asking about the first dance." James stared at the message, his jaw clenched. The woman he had married just hours ago was worried about their first dance while his mother was hiding in the staff room, hurt and humiliated. In that moment, he realized that his perfect wedding day had revealed an ugly truth about the person he had chosen to spend his life with. Taking a deep breath, he typed a reply. "Meet me in the library in 5 minutes. We need to talk." It was time for Victoria to learn the truth about the woman she had just mocked. Her mother-in-law, Margaret Harrison, who had worked as a janitor at the Rosewood Hotel for 30 years to give her son a better life. Victoria walked quickly through the hotel corridors, her expensive wedding dress rustling with each step. She was annoyed that James had disappeared during their reception, especially when they were supposed to have their first dance. The champagne's effects were starting to wear off, but she still couldn't understand why everyone was acting so strangely. When she reached the hotel's library, she found James standing by the window. The room was quiet and dark, with only a few lamps providing soft light. James didn't turn around when she entered. "There you are," Victoria said, trying to sound cheerful. "Everyone's waiting for us. We need to do our first dance, and then cut the cake." James slowly turned to face her. Victoria's smile faded when she saw his expression. His eyes were red, and he looked like he had been crying. "Sit down, Victoria," he said quietly, pointing to one of the leather armchairs. "We need to talk about what just happened in the ballroom." Victoria sat down, feeling confused. "What do you mean? Everything's perfect." "Well, except for that awkward moment with the cleaning lady, but I took care of that. She shouldn't have been there during our reception anyway." James's hands tightened into fists. "That cleaning lady," he said, his voice shaking, "is Margaret Harrison, my mother." Victoria's face went pale. For a moment, she thought she had heard him wrong. "What? No, that's impossible. Your mother works abroad, helping communities in other countries. You told me." "I never told you that," James interrupted. "You assumed it, and I let you believe it. My mother has worked as a janitor at this hotel for 30 years. She worked extra shifts and overtime to put me through medical school. Everything I am today, I owe to her hard work and sacrifice." Victoria felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the arms of the chair tightly. But why didn't you tell me?" "My mother wanted to see what kind of person you really were," James said, his voice growing harder. "She suggested keeping her job a secret, to make sure you loved me for who I am, not for what we have now. She was going to surprise you tonight, welcome you to the family." His voice cracked. "Instead, you humiliated her in front of everyone." Tears started rolling down Victoria's cheeks as the reality of what she had done hit her. "James, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." "You're sorry because she's my mother," James said. "But would you be sorry if she was just another janitor? The way you acted tonight, the things you said, that showed me exactly who you are, Victoria." Victoria stood up, reaching for him. "Please, James, let me fix this. Let me apologize to her. I was drunk. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," James said, stepping away from her. "The alcohol just made you honest. My mother raised me alone after my father died. She worked 3 jobs to send me to the best schools. Even now, when I begged her to retire, she keeps working because she believes in the dignity of honest work." Victoria felt sick. The perfect wedding she had planned was crumbling around her. Where is she? Please, let me talk to her. She's gone home, James said. And I'm going too. I need time to think about whether I can stay married to someone who would treat another human being the way you treated my mother. James, please. Victoria sobbed, but he was already walking toward the door. At the doorway, he paused and turned back. You know what the saddest part is? My mother was so excited to meet you. She bought a special dress for the reception. She was going to change into it after her shift and surprise you. She wanted to welcome her new daughter-in-law with open arms. He shook his head. Instead, you showed her and everyone else exactly what kind of person you really are. With those final words, James left the library, leaving Victoria alone with the devastating consequences of her actions. Through the walls, she could still hear the music from her perfect wedding reception, but now it sounded more like a funeral march. Margaret Harrison sat in her small but tidy living room, still wearing her gray janitor's uniform. Her hands were folded in her lap as she stared at the special dress she had bought for the wedding reception, a beautiful blue gown that now hung untouched on her closet door. Robert, James's best friend, had driven her home from the hotel, and now she waited for her son to arrive. As she sat there, memories of the past 30 years flooded her mind. She remembered the day her husband David died in a car accident, leaving her alone with their 4-year-old son, James. They had very little money and no insurance. But Margaret had made a promise to herself that her son would have every opportunity in life. She had started working at the Rosewood Hotel as a janitor when James was 5 years old. The job paid little, but it offered health insurance and steady work. During the day, she cleaned hotel rooms, and at night, she worked as a waitress at a small diner. On weekends, she did laundry for some of the wealthy families in town. Honest work is nothing to be ashamed of, she had always told James. What matters is doing your best at whatever job you have. The sound of a car pulling up outside brought Margaret back to the present. A few moments later, James walked through the door. His bow tie was undone, and his eyes were red from crying. "Mom," he said softly, sitting next to her on the old sofa, "I'm so sorry about what happened." Margaret reached out and took her son's hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for, James. You didn't do anything wrong." "I should have told Victoria the truth from the beginning," James said, his voice filled with regret. "I shouldn't have kept your job a secret." Margaret shook her head. "No, son, I asked you to keep it quiet, remember? I wanted to see what kind of person Victoria really was. And now we know." James looked at the blue dress hanging on the closet door, and fresh tears filled his eyes. Margaret followed his gaze and smiled sadly. "I saved for 6 months to buy that dress," she said. "I wanted to look nice when I surprised Victoria at the reception. I was going to change after my shift and join the party as your mother. I had this whole speech planned about welcoming her to our family." She squeezed James's hand before continuing. "You know, in all my years of cleaning at that hotel, I've seen every kind of person. Some guests treat me like I'm invisible. Others stop to chat and ask about my day. You can tell a lot about people by how they treat those they think are beneath them." James nodded, remembering all the life lessons his mother had taught him over the years. How she had encouraged him to study hard, to be kind to everyone, to never look down on anyone who worked for a living. "When you told me you wanted to be a doctor," Margaret continued, "I knew it would be hard. But I remembered what your father always said. Nothing worth having comes easy. So I picked up extra shifts, worked holidays, did whatever I had to do." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small garden she had planted in their tiny backyard. "I'm not ashamed of being a janitor, James. That job put you through medical school. It paid for your books, your uniforms, your study materials. Every toilet I cleaned, every floor I mopped, every spill I wiped up, it was all for you." James joined his mother at the window. "You're the strongest person I know, Mom. I'm so proud to be your son." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes filled with wisdom and love. "Life has a way of showing us who people really are. Tonight wasn't just about Victoria insulting me. It was about her showing us what's truly in her heart." Back at the Rosewood Hotel, Victoria sat alone at her sweetheart table, still wearing her expensive wedding dress. The grand ballroom was almost empty now. Most of the guests had left after hearing about what had happened, whispering among themselves as they walked out. The waiters were clearing tables around her, carefully avoiding eye contact. The beautiful flowers that had cost thousands of dollars were starting to wilt. Half-empty champagne glasses and dirty plates covered the tables. Everything that had seemed so perfect just hours ago now looked sad and meaningless. Sarah, her maid of honor, approached the table carefully. "Victoria, let me take you home." Victoria shook her head, staring at her diamond wedding ring. "I can't believe this is happening. How did everything go so wrong?" "Your father already paid the hotel bill," Sarah said softly. "He and your mother left about an hour ago. They seemed pretty upset." Victoria could imagine how upset they were. Her parents had always taught her to be polite to everyone, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten those lessons. Instead, she had become exactly the kind of rich, spoiled person they had warned her not to be. "Did you know?" Victoria asked Sarah about James's mother. Sarah sat down next to her friend. "No, I didn't. But Vicky, that's not the point. The way you treated that woman, whether she was James's mother or not, it wasn't right." Victoria's phone buzzed. It was another message from James. "I'm staying at my mom's house tonight. I need time to think." Tears rolled down Victoria's cheeks, smearing her perfect makeup. The wedding planner, Mrs. Thompson, walked over to their table. Victoria noticed that the woman's friendly smile from earlier was gone. "Miss Chen," Mrs. Thompson said formally, "Margaret Harrison has been working at this hotel since before I became the event planner. She's one of our most dedicated employees. I've watched her work extra shifts for years to put her son through medical school." Victoria felt even worse hearing this. Mrs. Thompson continued, "Every guest who has ever met Margaret knows what a kind and hard-working person she is. She was so excited about your wedding. She even helped us set up the ballroom this morning, making sure everything was perfect for her son's big day." More tears fell as Victoria imagined Margaret carefully arranging things for the wedding, knowing she would finally meet her daughter-in-law later that day. Instead of a happy family moment, Victoria had given her cruel words and public humiliation. "I need to find her," Victoria said suddenly, standing up. "I need to apologize." "I don't think that's a good idea right now," Sarah said, gently pulling her friend back down. "Give them some time. What happened tonight? It can't be fixed with just a simple apology." Victoria looked around the empty ballroom. The expensive band she had hired was packing up their instruments. The giant wedding cake, which had cost more than a car, stood barely touched. All the money she had spent trying to create the perfect wedding hadn't mattered in the end. Instead, she had shown everyone her true character in the worst possible way. "What have I done?" she whispered, reality finally hitting her hard. "I've ruined everything." Sarah put an arm around her friend's shoulders. "You made a terrible mistake, Vicky, but what matters now is what you do next." Victoria nodded slowly, her mind going back to the look in Margaret's eyes when she had told her to leave the reception. There had been no anger in those eyes, just dignity and sadness. That look would haunt Victoria forever. "Let's get you home," Sarah said gently. "Tomorrow's another day." As they walked out of the ballroom, Victoria took one last look at her ruined wedding reception. The perfect day she had planned had turned into a nightmare, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had lost her new husband, embarrassed her family, and worst of all, hurt someone who had only shown dedication and hard work her entire life. The weight of her actions felt heavier than her wedding dress as she left the hotel, knowing that some mistakes can never be fully undone. The next morning, Victoria stood nervously outside Margaret Harrison's small house. She had barely slept, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She had changed from her wedding dress into simple jeans and a sweater, leaving her expensive jewelry at home. The house was modest but well kept, with a small garden full of colorful flowers. A worn welcome mat lay at the front door. Victoria's hand shook as she reached for the doorbell. A few moments later, James opened the door. He looked tired, still wearing his clothes from yesterday. When he saw Victoria, his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. "Please," Victoria whispered. "I need to apologize to your mother. I couldn't sleep all night thinking about what I did." Before James could answer, Margaret's voice came from inside the house. "Let her in, James. I'll hear what she has to say." James stepped aside, and Victoria walked into the small living room. Margaret sat in an armchair, wearing a simple dress instead of her work uniform. The blue dress she had bought for the wedding reception still hung on the closet door, a painful reminder of yesterday's events. "Mrs. Harrison," Victoria began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for how I behaved yesterday. I was cruel and thoughtless, and... Margaret held up her hand, stopping Victoria's words. "Sit down," she said firmly but not unkindly. Victoria sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. James remained standing by the door, watching silently. "I've been working at the Rosewood Hotel for 30 years, Margaret began. I've cleaned up after thousands of wealthy guests. Some of them have treated me like I was invisible. Others have been kind and respectful. But nobody, in all those years, has ever spoken to me the way you did yesterday." Tears started rolling down Victoria's cheeks, but Margaret continued. "I'm not angry about what you said to me. I'm sad because you showed me exactly what kind of person you are. The way people treat those they think are beneath them says everything about their character." "I don't think you're beneath me," Victoria said quickly. "I was drunk and stupid and—" "Being drunk doesn't make you say things you don't mean," Margaret interrupted. "It just makes you brave enough to say what you're really thinking." James moved closer to his mother's chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Margaret reached up and patted his hand before continuing. "When James told me he was going to marry you, I was so happy. I thought about all the family dinners we would have, the holidays we would spend together, the grandchildren I might get to spoil someday." She smiled sadly. "That's why I wanted to keep my job a secret at first. I wanted to know if you would love my son for who he is, not for what he has become." Victoria felt shame burning in her chest. "I do love James," she said softly. "Maybe you do," Margaret replied. "But you don't respect the values he was raised with. You don't understand that there's dignity in all honest work. Every dollar I earned cleaning that hotel helped put James through medical school. I've never been ashamed of being a janitor." She stood up slowly, walking to the closet where the blue dress hung. "I bought this dress for your wedding. I was going to change into it after my shift and surprise you. I wanted to look nice when I welcomed you to our family." Victoria couldn't stop crying now. "I'm so sorry," she repeated. "Please, tell me how I can fix this." Margaret turned back to face her. "Some things can't be fixed with just an apology, Victoria. Trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild. James needs to decide if he can stay married to someone who showed such cruelty to others. And I need to decide if I can welcome into my family someone who thinks it's okay to humiliate others because of their job." The room fell silent except for Victoria's quiet sobs. Through the window, they could see the morning sun shining on Margaret's flower garden. Beautiful blooms that had grown from years of patient care and hard work. Just like everything else in Margaret Harrison's life. 3 months had passed since the disastrous wedding day. Victoria sat in her therapist's office, where she had been coming twice a week since that day. The expensive rings she had worn so proudly were no longer on her finger. "I've been volunteering at the community center," Victoria told Dr. Roberts, her therapist. "Last week, I helped serve meals at the homeless shelter. It's strange. A few months ago, I would have thought that kind of work was beneath me." Dr. Roberts nodded encouragingly. "And how does it make you feel now?" "Humble," Victoria replied softly. "And useful, really useful, for the first time in my life." After the confrontation at Margaret's house, James had asked for some time apart. Victoria had moved out of their expensive apartment and into a smaller place. She had taken a leave of absence from her banking job to focus on personal growth. The first few weeks had been the hardest. Victoria had to face her own prejudices and examine where they came from. She thought about her privileged upbringing, about how she had slowly become the kind of person who looked down on others. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she now volunteered at the local community center. She worked alongside people from all walks of life, retired teachers, former executives, college students, and yes, janitors. Each of them had their own story, their own dignity, their own worth. "I saw Margaret yesterday," Victoria said to her therapist, "at the grocery store." "Did you speak to her?" Victoria shook her head. "No, but I watched her helping an elderly man who couldn't reach something on a high shelf. She was so kind, so natural about it. Just like James always said she was." James had filed for an annulment of their marriage 2 months ago. Victoria hadn't fought it. She understood that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with apologies alone. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. "I've been thinking about making a change," Victoria said. "I'm not sure I want to go back to investment banking." "What would you like to do instead?" Victoria smiled slightly. The community center needs a full-time coordinator for their job training program. They help people learn new skills, find better jobs. The pay is much lower than what I made at the bank, but, Dr. Roberts prompted. But it feels right, Victoria finished. Like maybe I could help make a real difference in people's lives. Later that day, Victoria walked through the community center, looking at the faces of the people she had come to know over the past months. There was Mr. Chen, no relation, a former factory worker learning computer skills. Maria, a single mother studying for her GED. Tom, a veteran teaching others how to repair cars. As she helped Maria with her math homework, Victoria thought about Margaret Harrison. She thought about 30 years of honest work, about a mother's sacrifice for her child, about the dignity that came from doing your job well, no matter what that job was. Victoria knew she would probably never fully repair the damage she had done that day at the wedding. James had moved to another city for a new job. Margaret still worked at the Rosewood Hotel, though Victoria never went there anymore. But something had changed inside Victoria. The shallow, prejudiced woman who had mocked a hard-working janitor was slowly disappearing. In her place was someone new, someone who understood that true worth had nothing to do with the size of your paycheck or the clothes you wore. As she left the community center that evening, Victoria saw the cleaning lady, Mrs. Rodriguez, mopping the floors. A few months ago, she would have walked past without a glance. Now, she stopped. "Would you like some help with that, Mrs. Rodriguez?" she asked. The older woman smiled and handed her a mop. Together, they cleaned the community center floors, and Victoria felt no shame. Instead, she felt something she had never expected: pride in doing honest work, just like Margaret Harrison had taught her son all those years ago. Sometimes, Victoria realized, the most important lessons in life come from the people we least expect to be our teachers. And sometimes, losing everything you thought you wanted helps you find what you really need.